Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Zelenskyy addresses EU leaders at a security summit in Brussels, saying Putin must stop his unnecessary demands. At least 91 Palestinians killed and dozens wounded as Israeli strikes across Gaza again continue. And former Zimbabwean swimmer and two-time Olympic gold medalist Kirsty Coventry has been elected the president of the International Olympic Committee. Our top story today, EU leaders met at a summit in Brussels today to consider their defence strategy and how they can boost security measures for Ukraine. They agreed that no real negotiations are taking place at the moment after discussing Donald Trump's attempts to get Russia to agree on a ceasefire deal. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who is visiting Norway, addressed them via video link. Let's take a look at just what he had to say.
Yesterday, I had a productive conversation with President Trump. From the very beginning, Ukraine has been advocating for what we are discussing now, an end to attack on energy and infrastructure and ceasefire at sea, and we continue to support these efforts. Our teams will also work towards achieving an unconditional full ceasefire on land. Please support this. Putin must stop making unnecessary demands that only prolong the war and must start fulfilling what he promises the world.
For more on this, I'm joined by our correspondent, Stuart Smith, who is in Brussels. Stuart, thank you for joining me. Firstly, what else did Zelenskyy outline in his press conference today?
Well, he asked EU leaders to continue sanctions pressure on Russia until such a time, at least, that there is a ceasefire deal in place. He also asked the European Union for an additional €5 billion, something that he says will be essential for Ukraine to get the necessary artillery shells that it requires. And he said that he was interested in joining a new EU scheme called Rearm Europe, which is a way to fund around €150 billion of support for European defence industries, but also Ukraine would like to be part of that, saying it has a lot to offer any joint EU scheme because it has expertise and a defence industry which is now very capable when it comes to drones and anti-drone warfare, and also other technology which the EU suffers with. One interesting thing he also revealed during his press conference in Norway is that there will be Ukrainian representatives at upcoming talks in Saudi Arabia between Russia and the United States. They're not ever at any point going to be in the same room as each other, the Russian and Ukrainian delegation, and it will be a low-level technical team, and it's a discussion about ensuring safety in the Black Sea, but it's being seen as a form of progress with both teams, Ukraine and Russian, in one country, in one place, and while not talking about the peace as such, they are talking about issues that are affected by this war.
Stuart, what else have European Union leaders agreed to today?
The focus has been, for the first 2 hours on Thursday, Ukraine and what European Union leaders can do to help there. And they agreed at the end of that discussion to support the Kyiv-Washington call for an immediate ceasefire without any preconditions, something that Russia has not agreed to. But it took Hungary not signing to get that through in an unaltered form. Previously at EU summits, going back years, Hungary has been a sticking point when it comes to getting all 27 EU member states to agree on an issue. It could take days of extra negotiation just to get Budapest on side. Now it seems when it comes to the sticky issue of Ukraine, which Hungary sees very differently to the rest of the EU 26 member states, the leaders have just decided to produce documents and sign agreements that, where they don't require Hungary's support, just include the beliefs and opinions of the 26 EU member states. They've also been talking about competition, how to make the EU more competitive on the global stage, particularly with a view to the US and China. And on that vein, they've been discussing what they can do to boost the EU automobile sector, the steel and metals industry, and also the defence sector, with, while not being a part of formal discussions, a view on those UF tariffs, with many EU member states very upset that the EU's response to those tariffs has effectively really harmed many of the EU's industries, in particular member states, like alcohol tariffs being imposed on French wine and champagne, and also the Italian liquor sector suffering particularly as the US and EU trade war ramps up.
Meanwhile, in England, senior military leaders from the Coalition of the Willing are meeting to discuss their peacekeeping plans too. What's the latest there? Briefly for us, Stuart.
Yeah, more than 25 countries gathering for that, online and in person. The idea is, in this second technical meeting, to go into granular detail about what various countries from as far away as Asia can contribute if there is a ceasefire deal negotiated. The Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, says it's important to have a plan ready in case that happens soon, but there is still the unaddressed question, in effect, of the fact that Russia doesn't want any NATO-flagged peacekeepers in Ukraine, would not accept that, which is a core component, it seems, of the plan that's currently being worked on.
Stuart Smith in Brussels, thank you so much for being across all that news for us. For more on this, I'm now joined by Professor Michael Semple from Queen's University Belfast, who spent many years researching armed conflict. Thank you so much for joining me. So we've just been speaking to Stuart in Brussels. All EU leaders have reaffirmed support for Ukraine's borders today, except Hungary, as Stuart just outlined. Earlier today, the Kremlin said Europe is party of war. How and where does the US fit into this puzzle?
Europe is trying hard to maintain a united line with the United States, while obviously unsure of what the US will be supporting as they go forward. So the EU is trying to stick with its support for Ukraine, to double down on a definition of what Ukraine is fighting for and what Europe will support in terms of what a free and sovereign Ukraine would look like. And the EU is trying to mobilize European resources for defense, which is something which the US has long requested by showing that they're willing to come up with the resources to defend themselves and to support Ukraine. They're trying to encourage the US to stick with them on this.
What does the limited ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia cover, and who is holding both countries accountable for upholding the ceasefire?
An excellent question, and one to which, unfortunately, there now are several different answers. The original version of the unconditional temporary ceasefire proposal, which was agreed between the US and Ukraine, was something which was to cover the whole of the front line and be at least a 30 days cessation to the fighting. But after the discussion between the US and Russia, this seems to have been greatly reduced to just a pause in attacks on energy infrastructure, and even the definition of quite which infrastructure would be covered by that, even that is uncertain until they move towards technical talks. So it started off as a fairly limited ceasefire proposal. Now it's a very limited ceasefire proposal, the exact contours of which still have to be agreed.
Professor, Zelenskyy says he has not discussed US ownership of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant with Donald Trump. That's despite the US talking of American ownership. Would US ownership of Ukrainian nuclear power plants offer a security guarantee for the country right now? It appears the minerals deal is off the table.
Yes, there seems to be an idea which also sort of pops up in slightly different forms. I can see that in principle, having a sort of a direct US stake by ownership of assets or presence of their own personnel on the ground would give them a reason to keep on worrying about what's happening in Ukraine. But I think that we can take it from President Zelenskyy that there is no detailed proposal for that, and Zelensky's version is of course that he has considered how US could help them keep their nuclear infrastructure going, but has insisted that it's the Ukrainian state owns the nuclear infrastructure and it's going to stay that way. So yes, I think in principle, having an increased US stake in Ukrainian peace encourages it to keep on working to achieve that peace rather than just selling out.
Zelenskyy says Ukrainian and US officials will meet in Saudi on Monday. And we just also heard there from Stuart that separate talks will be happening there with Russian officials. Do you think this is a real step forward to the fact that everyone will be in the same place at the same time? It's a positive sign, do you think?
Absolutely. Nobody should underestimate the amount of work which is required in achieving an agreement, even for a temporary end to the fighting in a difficult conflict like this. So getting the parties together in Saudi Arabia is a major development. Now, of course, there are lots of doubts as to whether there is willingness on all sides, particularly on the Russian side, to go ahead with a meaningful agreement. But to give the best opportunity of getting there, then definitely having the Ukrainians accessible to discuss the details is really important. I think the very fact that even now we don't know exactly what the parameters of that temporary ceasefire agreement might be underlines the importance of having all parties accessible.
Professor Michael Semple from Queen's University, Belfast, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. Iran has released a French tourist who was detained by authorities for more than 2 years. French President Emmanuel Macron announced on social media that 34-year-old Olivier Rondeau is free and back with his family in France. He was arrested on the charges of conspiracy against the Islamic Republic and sentenced for 5 years in prison. President Trump will sign an executive order to shut down the Education Department today. It will mark the US leader's first attempt to shut down a cabinet-level agency. It comes as Trump and entrepreneur turned advisor Elon Musk seek to dismantle government departments and programs in an attempt to cut costs. Now, Greenpeace has been found liable for defaming an oil firm through protests. A US jury has ordered the environmental group to pay $600 million in damages to Texas-based Energy Transfer. The energy firm accused Greenpeace of trespass, nuisance, and civil conspiracy against the Dakota Access Pipeline. The organization says it plans to appeal the decision and is worried about facing bankruptcy from this case. And finally, Finland has been named the happiest country in the world for the 8th year in a row now. That's according to the World Happiness Report that's been published today. Other Nordic countries, including Denmark, Iceland and Sweden, also claim the top spots. On the other end of the spectrum, Afghanistan has again been ranked as the unhappiest country in the world. At least 91 Palestinians were killed and dozens others wounded in Israeli strikes across Gaza earlier today as Israel continued to attack the Strip. A new ground campaign was launched yesterday with major vital roads closed off. Israel says Hamas is still holding 59 hostages, 24 of whom are believed to be alive. The two sides are still to agree on how to progress beyond the first stage of the ceasefire, which did expire earlier this month. We can go to our correspondent now, Giles Gibson, who is in Tel Aviv. Giles, thank you for joining me. Hopes for peace were high after the ceasefire deal, but with no second phase in sight and more than 430 people killed by Israeli strikes over the past 2 days, will we continue to see attacks like today's carry on?
Yeah, absolutely no sign of any sort of phase two, and airstrikes continuing, ground operations now underway by the Israeli military in Gaza, rockets being fired in the other direction by Hamas from Gaza towards Tel Aviv. So really we can say that the ceasefire as a whole has collapsed. So any sort of a new deal would pretty much have to be done from scratch. We heard in the last few hours from the Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz saying that he'd had a meeting with the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, approving the battle plans for the coming days in terms of the situation on the ground in Gaza. So really over the next few days, we expect the bombardment from the air to continue. We expect those ground operations to continue and both to potentially intensify.
Earlier, we actually mentioned the hostages being held by Hamas, Giles. Is that the main bone of contention for Israel right now?
Well, I mentioned that meeting that the Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz had in the last few hours, and he said that we will not stop in terms of the military action until all hostages are released. But at the same time, the hostages here in Israel have also become a very powerful symbol in terms of the opposition to this war. We've seen some very large protests for the second day in a row in Jerusalem, with demonstrators coming out and saying that this military action is putting the lives of the remaining hostages inside Gaza at risk. And these protesters are also angry about plans by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to sack the head of the internal security service here in Israel, known as Shin Bet.
Hamas claimed they fired rockets at Israel for the first time since the ceasefire agreement did collapse, Giles. Where were these rockets targeting and what damage did they cause?
Yeah, this was a really significant moment because until now we hadn't seen Hamas actually responding in a military way to these airstrikes which started in the early hours of Tuesday. There was no clear answer as to why they had not responded yet. Perhaps they were trying to show restraint. Perhaps their military capabilities had simply been degraded over many months of war, or perhaps it was suggested they were preserving ammunition because they were preparing to fight the ground offensive by Israeli forces. Now, Hamas didn't actually specify exactly what targets they were aiming at when they fired those rockets towards Tel Aviv. But we did hear from the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, saying that one of the rockets was actually intercepted, and then two others fired towards Tel Aviv landed in what were described as open areas.
Giles Gibson in Tel Aviv, thank you so much for joining us. We can now go to Budour Hassan, a researcher from Amnesty International for Israel and Palestinian territories, who joins us from Ramallah. Thank you so much for joining us. So we just heard there from Giles, who was explaining the situation on the ground to us. Can you tell us more about what's happening?
So just a reminder that Israel has been fully besieging Gaza since the 2nd of March, blocking 1 week later the electricity supply to the sole functional water desalination plant. This comes on the heel of over 15 months of extremely severe blockade where Israel used the imposition of conditions calculated to bring about the destructions of Palestinians through means of mass displacement, denial of aid, destruction of critical infrastructure to the survival of the population, in addition to the several indiscriminate and direct attacks on the population, inflicting on them physical and mental harm over such an extended period of time. And now with the unilateral decision of Israel to break the truce and resume its relentless bombardment over Gaza, the situation there, and as Amnesty, we do have a field worker based in the Gaza Strip, and we've been researching the situation there over the past 16 months. It's nothing short of catastrophic, really, especially in the north, where already Israel's several attacks on the healthcare system has all but decimated it. In one area, once a Shifa hospital, once the largest hospital, not only in Gaza, but in the entirety of the occupied Palestinian territory, now only has 3 functioning beds. The main hospital receiving the wounded is Al Ahli Baptist Hospital, which is usually a very small hospital. Very few ambulances are working because of the lack of fuel. Israel has banned the entry of anything, including fuel, food, and water since the 2nd of March. The wounded are carried on carts, horse-drawn carts, some on the shoulders of their loved ones. When you said that there were 90 people who were killed and dozens injured, behind this word dozens injured, there is almost a death sentence, because many of those injured will not find any proper treatment, including for those who would have been easily cured had the situation been anything close to normal. The news we're receiving about amputations being conducted on children without anesthesia, the situation, hospitals are completely incapable of treating the volume of the wounded that they are receiving. We're kind of returning to the very first days of the attacks, only now the impact is so much greater precisely because of the destruction of critical infrastructure, particularly the healthcare system in Gaza.
It's an extremely difficult time at the moment in Gaza, but Hamas is being accused of not releasing the remaining hostages. Are they continuing to put their own people in danger by not abiding to this call from Israel?
Look, it's very important to reiterate, civilian hostages should never have been taken in the first place. Palestinians arbitrarily detained without charges or trial by Israel should never have been held in jail in the first place, including healthcare workers. Both parties are obliged unconditionally, Hamas is obliged to release all civilian hostages it's holding and treat the others captives humanely. Israel is obliged to release all Palestinians arbitrarily detained unconditionally and treat all others humanely, while also ensuring ICRC access. Now, the fact that Israel cannot collectively punish the civilian population, it cannot. It's very clear collective punishment is prohibited under international law, regardless of what the purpose. You cannot treat 2 million people living in Gaza presuming that they are Hamas. You cannot use blockade, including cutting off water, access to water, electricity, fuel, and food as a means to pressure the civilian population. So international law here is super clear. There is no space to have even question marks over what Israel is doing. In addition to the throwing of leaflets, what we are seeing now through the leaflets being thrown on the calling for mass displacement of the population again, the threats against civilians, you either stay or leave, you either stay to face killing or leave and be ethnically cleansed. So all of these, what Israel is doing has absolutely no basis in international law, no justification. That Hamas has held hostages unlawfully does not justify any of the practices, policies, and acts that we are seeing by Israel since the 7th of October, but particularly since the resumption of the war.
Budour Hassan, a researcher for Amnesty International. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Now, former Zimbabwean swimmer Kirsty Coventry has been elected as the president of the International Olympic Committee. Coventry is an Olympic double gold medal winner and becomes the first woman and the first African in the job. Here's how she heard the news.
Dear friends and colleagues, the 144th IOC session has elected as the 10th president of the International Olympic Committee, Mrs. Kirsty Coventry.
For more on this, I'm joined by sports journalist and editor Mark Lomas. Mark, I'm a very proud girl from Zimbabwe today. We're actually from the same city. So why is this such a momentous moment, not just for me and Zimbabwean girls, but for the whole world of sport?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, congratulations, I guess, for you as well, for a fellow Zimbabwean. No, it's a massive position in world sport. If you think about positions of influence, probably president of FIFA, president of the IOC, these are the absolutely most influential positions in global sport. And Kirsty Coventry now has one of those. So she has the ability to influence sporting policy and to influence the Olympic movement over the next 8 years, at least 8 years, potentially 12. And of course, she described it as an extraordinary moment, and it absolutely is, because, as you mentioned, the first woman and first African to hold the post. So the opportunity there is to influence sport over the next 8 to 12 years. Plenty of Olympic cycles, Summer Olympics, obviously coming up in Los Angeles in 2028, Brisbane 2032, and from a Gulf perspective, it's interesting because both Saudi Arabia and Qatar have been tipped to potentially bid for the Olympics in 2036, and Kirsty Coventry may still be around then to have a role in that decision as well.
Yeah, it's absolutely thrilling. I was just thinking today, someone all the way from Zim doing so well. But there's been some controversy. Coventry was widely seen as Thomas Bach's preferred choice. What more can you tell us about the transparency of the voting process?
It's not that transparent, I guess, is the main thing. So, yeah, the process is quite a closed process. So those who were voting, I think there were 97 people who ended up voting. Kirsty Coventry, it was expected actually to be a close race, and it wasn't. Kirsty Coventry won in an absolute majority of 47 in the first round of voting, but no one has been able to kind of pin their colours to the mast. You're not allowed to be able to say who you're voting for. It's quite opaque. It's been compared to the voting in of the Pope, for example, in terms of how behind closed doors it is. People had to come when they voted and hand their phones in at the door. So yeah, it's a very behind closed doors process. But Kirsty Coventry was seen as one of the leading contenders, but I would say that Lord Coe, the British former Olympian and president of World Athletics, was up there, and Juan Antonio Samaranch as well, whose father was a former IOC president. They were right in contention as well, thought to be, but in the end, Kirsty Coventry, she swept the board, and I think a lot of people still respect IOC President Thomas Bach outgoing, and I think her allegiance to him worked very much in her favour in this vote.
I just wanted to touch on protecting women's sport. It's really been in the spotlight, and Lord Coe said he would put a blanket ban on transgender women competing in the female category if he was elected. We also saw Donald Trump signing an executive order essentially doing the same thing. How is the IOC expected to deal with these concerns going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, coming on the back of the Paris Olympics as well, with the controversy with boxers Iman Khatif and Lin Yuting, it's a big talking point in sport right now. Kirsty Coventry she's nailed her colours to the post, I think, already. So she said that she would also call for a blanket ban, although she has said that the dialogue between stakeholders is needed. But in an interview last month, she said that it was essential for maintaining the integrity of women's sport, that transgender athletes were not allowed to compete in female events.
And I just want to shift gears slightly. Formula One team owner, former Formula One team owner and broadcaster Eddie Jordan has died at the age of 76. What will his legacy be?
Oh, Eddie, as a fan of Formula One growing up in the 90s, Eddie Jordan was such an important figure. He's charismatic, colourful, beyond Formula One. He was a drummer, he did loads of work for charity, but he'll be best remembered as the team owner of Jordan and for blooding some youngsters into Formula One, including Michael Schumacher, Heinz-Harald Frentzen, Giancarlo Fisichella. Michael Schumacher, obviously, head and shoulders above the rest there. But yeah, I still remember when Damon Hill won Jordan's only F1 Grand Prix in Belgium, and just Eddie Jordan's celebrations were absolutely remarkable. A great man and a big loss for motorsport. He had a great career afterwards in the media as well. Just such a charismatic, special figure in Formula One.
Dare I say it, I remember Formula One in the 90s too, watching it with my father. But thank you so much, sports journalist and editor Mark Lomas, for bringing us all of that.
Pleasure.
Let's take a look at the top business news now. Nike is expected to post its steepest revenue decline in nearly 5 years in its quarterly results on Thursday. This comes as its new products fail to attract Americans reluctant to snap up non-essential items like sporting goods and clothing. Downloads of Nike mobile app for the quarter were down 35% from a year earlier, while foot traffic at Nike stores was also down 11%. Turkish markets are showing signs of stabilizing on Thursday after plunging to a record low. That's as authorities took action to offset any spike in demands for dollars following the shock detention of President Erdogan's main political rival. The central bank says it was monitoring currency markets and intervening when necessary. Turning to sports news now, and Chelsea have completed the double signing of Sporting Lisbon midfielders Giovanni Kenda and Dario Issu for a combined fee of over $80 million. 17-year-old Kenda will join Chelsea for a fee of up to $57 million, but will remain in Lisbon until the end of the 2025-2026 season. The Portuguese pair are the latest young players signed by the London club. And tennis world number 3 Carlos Alcaraz does not support the legal action being taken against governing bodies by the Players' Union co-founded by Novak Djokovic. On Tuesday, the Professional Tennis Players Association filed papers criticising the schedule, ranking systems and control over image rights. Both the ATP and the WTA Tour have been critical of that very lawsuit. A reminder of our top stories. Zelenskyy addresses EU leaders at their security summit in Brussels, saying Putin must stop his unnecessary demands. At least 19 Palestinians killed and dozens wounded as Israeli strikes across Gaza continue. And former Zimbabwean swimmer and double gold medalist Kirsty Coventry has been elected as the president of the International Olympic Committee. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. The dressing room is coming up next. And of course, don't miss Tom Burgess-Watson. Good night and thank you for joining me.